One characteristic of effective negotiations, which also applies to buyer-seller negotiations, is the relationship between the two parties after the deal is closed. In other words, would the two parties want to do business with each other again? This is especially critical in mergers and acquisitions, since quite often the seller becomes part of management in the newly formed company. As a result, the development of trust and a workable relationship after the deal is done is an important element of these negotiations, as well as other types of buyer-seller negotiations where the two parties have to negotiate again. This guideline is also important in order to gain commitment to carry out the deal once it is concluded. In my interview with Mr. Fred Kidder, Fred stresses the importance of this guideline. He gives us an example of the importance of a negotiator helping the other party understand the implications of an agreement. At the same time, he cautions against exploiting an advantage in buyer-seller negotiations. Mr. Kidder is an attorney and partner in the law firm of Arter and Hadden in Cleveland, Ohio. He has over 27 years of experience as an attorney, specializing in business acquisitions, divestitures, and corporate taxation. Based on some of your experience, what are the critical factors which affect the outcome of these types of negotiations?
Well, I think perhaps the most important critical factor in this area is to make certain that your client or the person that you represent clearly understands the economics of where he is going and perhaps where he has been. Too often in dealing with the matter of buying or selling a business, one who has had a great deal of knowledge in operating his own business may not have the knowledge necessary to evaluate it in terms of the sale and how to structure that sale. Indeed, he may confuse the net economic result to himself as a result of going one way or another. He may think that he clearly has a bonanza of a transaction the way he has structured it in his mind, whereas you certainly want to be sure that you get to the net economic effect to that individual. And certainly this is important, equally so if you represent a buyer, because he may feel that the dollar cost of this transaction is so much. Many times, for example, he will tend to confuse the economics of borrowing money to buy a company, whereas when you explain to him that the borrowing of money to buy a company is merely a timing function in the transaction, because you have to pay the money eventually. He may have confused the effect of that, or he may have in the back of his mind another way to handle that when it arises down the road. So I suspect I'd have to say that the most critical factor in the negotiating in these transactions is understanding completely the economic effect of the transaction, whether you represent the buyer or whether you represent the seller.
Are there any non-economic factors? I'm thinking more along the lines of political factors, power factors, psychological factors.
Well, there are other factors that become involved in the area where primarily you represent the seller, and that is, even though this particular person in the sale of his business is going to have little or no difficulty in reaching a price for his business, all of a sudden the many years of his association will arise, and he will start to think about his moral obligations to those people that helped him become so successful. After all, I suspect that when you really look through it, the reason a business becomes valuable and successful is due, if not exclusively, almost exclusively to people. It's not easy to just push a button and make $1 million. If you have the right type of people around you over a period of time, and perhaps the right product and also the right business, you can become quite successful. And when this person then steps aside, many times that factor will hit him, perhaps in a late hour. And that is he doing what can be done to help these people that have been so faithful to him. That is a very, very critical point in the non-dollar economic area that he thinks about. Depending on his age, he may also stop a moment and wonder, well, I have something here that's very valuable. I certainly will have no difficulty in getting my dollar for what I have to sell. However, I'm only 52 years old. And what am I going to do? It's nice to say I will play golf every day of the week. It's nice to say I will have no difficulty keeping busy. But if he has come up through the hard grind of the business world, it sometimes can be very difficult for this person to merely turn it off at that age. And all of a sudden he will start to think about it and think, well, is there any way that I can realize my gain at this point and at the same time stay as an important factor in the operation itself?
What guidelines would you suggest for buyers or sellers who are preparing for a negotiation to either acquire or sell a company? What types of preparations should they take? What types of factors should they consider? I think we've been talking about some of them in the previous question, but perhaps you can specify some guidelines.
I think that a very, very important guideline to a person who is thinking of selling his business is to first get in touch with those people that have assisted him one way or another in the success of his business, whether that be his lawyer, whether that be his accountant, or whether that be a financial advisor in the form of a banker or otherwise, so that he has at his grasp the financial information about his company that is most necessary if he is seeking to sell his business. Similarly, if the person is seeking to buy a business, he should try to obtain as much financial information and data about the company's product, about its location, about the general nature of the community. Can he in fact go into a small town where this company has been all these years, and can he successfully become the owner of the company, and can he thereafter rely on the community to give him the kind of support that he probably will need in running that business, even though he may be selling his product on the West Coast or wherever. Along these lines of knowledge of what is happening, I do recall an experience that is rather narrow, but it does tend to develop the necessity of understanding what you're doing. I was asked by a very substantial company to come in and explain the difference between acquiring a small company through one procedure as contrasted with acquiring the company through an entirely different procedure, but in both cases ending up with the company. And I proceeded to explain this to the people that were going to be doing the negotiating right out the scene with the seller. I explained quite adequately the advantages to the client if he went roadway number 1 as contrasted with roadway number 2, strictly in terms of his net economic cost that I mentioned when we first started. It became quite apparent that there was an advantage in taking, let us say, roadway number 2 from his standpoint. So naturally, in putting his negotiating team together and his efforts in dealing with the potential seller, he did just that. He proceeded down roadway number 2 and negotiated his dollar amount keyed to that program. He happened to be pretty successful as he was negotiating. However, with every advantage in a certain situation, you're apt to find a disadvantage to someone. And the someone in this particular case was a disadvantage to the seller. As advantageous as this procedure was for us, it was similarly disadvantageous to the seller. The seller, however, did not know that at the time the transaction was being worked out, and he assumed it made no difference between these two courses, which of the two he followed. He was not going to sustain an economic disadvantage. At least he was quite unaware that one might even exist. He proceeded in this transaction all the way to the closing, and at that time Either his accountants or his lawyers pointed out this very difficult problem to him. He had already signed documents, and he absolutely refused to go through with the transaction, saying, "Sue me." He said, "This is unfair to me. I don't believe I should do this. I wouldn't have done this had I known. You forced me into this. You were a big company," etc. As a result of that, our client backed off, restructured the deal, and in effect compromised the difference between the two roads in a way to satisfy him, if you will, and it was almost a complete capitulation so that he had no adverse consequences as a result of these two roads. And when this was done, I did discuss this with the client again, because I had not been involved in any of the negotiations at that point, and it became apparent that when you do have an advantage in a negotiation and as you're going along, and if you realize that the other party to the transaction is just, if you will, stupid, or he doesn't see this, sometimes the advantage you're trying to take is far too great an advantage to expect that this is going to come out all right. It's going to have an adverse effect one way or the other. This particular company, as a result of this experience, made up its mind that the next time it got into one of these transactions, it was going to be absolutely certain that the seller understood as much about the net economic effect of the transaction that they did. And thus they were not going to face once again any of this very difficult situation which has got to come up some point. It just has to be noticed, and if you try to say, oh, well, you're already bound, you've got a very, very bad situation.
Mr. Kidder's illustration points out that a tactic which may be workable in the short run may have serious and negative consequences in the long run. One of the big trade-offs in buyer-seller negotiations is that of balancing short-term victories against long-term goals. The other side may be coerced or threatened into doing what you wish, or may be simply uninformed of a bad deal. In either case, you lose his support in future negotiations. So, to repeat an important guideline in buyer-seller negotiations, in negotiating, consider the implications of what tactics you use and what you gain as a settlement for the quality of a workable relationship after the deal is concluded. Will the deal be implemented? How will it affect my relationship in future negotiations? Sometimes buyers and sellers must negotiate under win-lose conditions. In the negotiations for mergers and acquisitions, these conditions are called unfriendly tender offers. Mr. Angeloff and Mr. Kidder give us examples of the leverage used under these conditions. First Mr. Angeloff, and then Mr. Kidder. Quite often in the area of acquisitions and mergers, a buyer will meet up with a seller who is resistant, who does not want to be acquired or merged with the buying company. And that sets up a different type of negotiations, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
How would you characterize those negotiations?
Those type of negotiations normally are severe to the extent of a very leveraged direction taken by the potential buyer against the seller. The examples that we can see in the papers almost on a daily basis are the tender offers that are being expounded. And tender offers can be friendly or they can be unfriendly.
Could you explain what a tender offer is?
Yes, a tender offer is where a company, normally publicly held, will make an offer publicly to acquire a certain percentage of the securities of another public company. Normally, an offer is made on a friendly basis, meaning that the management of the target company, the one that is being tried to be acquired, is going to go along with the proposed acquisition or tender by the larger company. That's what they call a friendly offer. An unfriendly tender is one in which the buying company knows it's going to get resistance from the management of the selling company, and that's called an unfriendly tender offer, and the management will resist in every way possible not to be acquired by the large tendering company.
What are some negotiating strategies and tactics used by buyers and sellers under these conditions?
Well, normally a buyer is looking for a company which is selling at a discount from its true market value. That's why it's making a tender. In most cases is to try to buy at a value that it could, under normal circumstances, not buy at. And even that, the buyer is buying above the present market, because normally tender offers are made at prices above what the prices they're selling. So they look for depressed type of situations where they can get a good value. That's normally the profile of the buyer. The seller is normally a company which has very little control from an ownership point of view that's kept within the insides of the company, that normally the public shareholder has a vast majority of the ownership of the company, and where maybe the insiders may only control 5 or 6 or 10% of the company, then obviously an outsider through a tender offer could obtain the other 95% to acquire really control of the company. So target companies are those that sell at a discount from their fair market value and normally have a very small effective stockholder base where the majority of the shares are held by the public, and so they have a vulnerability, as opposed to a publicly held company which has maybe a 50% ownership that's held by insiders and 50% by the public. It doesn't have the same vulnerability.
Where a company is resisting being acquired, are there other ways in which a buyer will attempt to gain leverage in addition to these economic factors that you mentioned?
Well, the way to gain leverage against a raider, as they call them, is to try to stop them legally by establishing legal defenses, trying to stop them through potential antitrust action if they happen to be competitors. And the ultimate is to become unavailable through an acquisition with a friendly company in the final analysis. If you can't block a tender attempt through legal or other governmental recourse, then your last straw is to team up with a friendly acquirer, and that's when you normally go out and get your big brother as a defense against the unfriendly tender.
And how about from the buyer's viewpoint, what kinds of strategies do you use?
The buyer tries to move quickly because surprise is very important. He tries to convince the management that combining with him they will do well. He tries to deal in cash if he can, as opposed to securities, because then securities is a judgmental factor. Is the value of the securities really X or is it Y, as opposed to cash? He has to use judgment that the price in which he's ready to tender will be generous enough to have the number of shares tendered that he really wants. As an example, if a company's securities were selling, let's say, at $30 a share, and their all-time high may have been 40, a tender who's coming in and may set up a price of $32 a share against a market price of 30. The probability of him gaining the shares that he wants to in the tender offer at 32, as opposed to a $40 price or maybe even a $45 price, is very substantial, because tender offers are very expensive ways of trying to acquire companies. Because if you're unsuccessful, you may have bought a block of stock that could be lower after the tender offer fails. You have your legal and expenses, your printing expenses, advertising expenses, very substantial. And so you could be a loser even as the tenderer by not being able to get your target company.
You mentioned that the buyer often attempts to influence or convince top management of the desirability of being acquired or merging. Are there attempts by a buyer to go beyond the top management into lower management?
Not really, Ed, because in the tender offers, timing is key, so that there's not really enough time for the normal courting of an acquisition or of a merger. And even trying to attract the top management, that's a very short in time duration, as opposed to regular merger negotiations that take place.
Are there attempts to decrease the economic viability of the company being sought after?
Oh yes. An example, one company that was the target was being acquired by a larger company. The target company intentionally acquired a small company that was in the line of business of the large acquiring company, knowing that that small company, irrespective of how small it would be a major factor in the antitrust people disallowing that merger for antitrust purposes, so that there are every avenues that are explored in trying to dissuade the tenderer from continuing his tender efforts.
In those cases where the management of the company being bought is resistant to the takeover, or perhaps the sellers intend, because of mismanagement, intend to provide a new approach to management and new managers, how does the buyer gain leverage in that type of situation?
Well, if he is coming into a situation that he is going to, in effect, have an uphill battle in accomplishing what he wants to accomplish, it is going to be very, very difficult. In many cases, all that he has to deal with, and I shouldn't say all, but what he is dealing with is coin of the realm, perhaps, and perhaps if he's going to try to accomplish this through his company doing it, he may be offering an equity position in his company in order to affect this situation. Beyond that, at that point, he doesn't have a great deal to offer. And if we go to the coin of the realm in terms of his leverage, as you perhaps have seen in the Wall Street Journal in the last few weeks, there have been at least two types of transactions where there have been competing interests trying to make an acquisition, and obviously the only thing they could deal with is how many dollars are they willing to put on the barrelhead. And that which started out at so many dollars was improved as the negotiating and the ability to accomplish this became more difficult. So from the buyer's standpoint, in order to accomplish what he's doing, unless he can get this cooperation of the directors and or management of the acquired or target company, he really has very little he can do if he's going to just be out here offering dollars or offering stock. It gets very, very difficult for him.
What?
On the other side of the coin, namely those that are trying to oppose such a takeover, I suspect the one thing that they have going for them above all others is that of time. If they can find some way to slow down the offering process in order to slow down the decision making as to whether this transaction will or will not have a go, no go on it, they then have a chance to deal with their owners in trying to present their position. What will happen many times when this type of a transaction gets started, and when it is as adverse as we suggest here, what management will do is they will immediately try to find a way to slow this process way down so it can't occur, and in the meantime they literally scramble to find another type of acquisition that is more compatible, let us say, with their position in the transaction. They would like to find a transaction where that if the company is to be sold or otherwise delivered, it is going into a package that is more compatible and perhaps more beneficial to themselves and their owners. So this is what they will do. Depending on the nature of the acquisition, many acquisitions, for example, of this nature that you and I are speaking to, occur because the target company has been run with an ultra-conservative approach. When that has occurred, many times what you will find is that you will find a company that, as the people say, is more like a bank than it is an operating company. It has far more either liquidity or assets that are really not necessary to maintain the level of operation that you here see. This may well be one of the attractions. This is why the people are trying to acquire it, because they see something in the financial makeup of this company that tells to them, goodness, I've got something here that I can now expand. It has all types of potential. It has more than enough money to do many things, so I will go after it. Management, on the other hand, when it sees this happening, and if it is as liquid as I say, may take a rather unique step that happens, I wouldn't say frequently, but certainly not rarely, and that is that they take this liquidity and they try to find a way to immediately distribute that liquidity to their existing owners. And by so doing, they reduce the attraction of what is here. And this has happened many times, too. This is a technique. It's in many ways an unfortunate technique, but it is a technique. It's what the sellers will do, the potential sellers.
How does the company acquiring a target company counteract those obstructive tactics?
Well, the people that are seeking to make the acquisition probably have very little that they can do about such a situation at that point. They certainly have no basis to oppose this distribution technique that I talk about. They certainly would be well advised to do their homework well in advance as to what the potential seller may try to do to block them, and if that is a strong potential in trying to stretch out, if you will, the period for concluding the decision on the acquisition, there are steps that they can take to make certain that they have touched all the bases so as to avoid these technical obstacles that the sellers or that the management of the sellers will tend to put in their way, whether that be reviewing critically filing requirements with various departments of federal and state government and things of that nature, so that when you move on your program in this area, you are well grounded and you're not going to have those kind of technical obstacles raised in your path.
I'm not quite sure how the checking with filings is a way of dealing with the obstacles.
I didn't mean to imply checking with filings. I meant to state actual filings. There are various rules that require that if in fact you're going out to try to take over this company, you must file in certain areas, whether it be the SEC or whether it be the State Security Division or whatnot. You must make these filings in order to be able to proceed with your tender offer, if that's what you have. You proceed on that basis, and thus you have touched all the bases. The target company then has a more difficult time opposing you on a technical basis. On the other hand, you may conclude that you can whiz right by some of these filings. If that is the approach, many times the target company will then try to file in, say, the Division of Securities or someplace to say you have not complied with this. And this is that technical obstacle that I spoke to previously. It has, at the very least, given the management this necessary time within which to regroup and form a game plan.
The previous cassette on negotiating for money examined several bargaining tactics which are also useful for buyer-seller negotiations, including making the initial offer, the final offer tactic, the use of concessions, and several others. One other common tactic is the good guy, bad guy maneuver. Mr. Neil Ryan describes this tactic and how it can be used to our advantage in buyer-seller negotiations.
It often is helpful to have a calculated sort of good guy and bad guy. Oftentimes your own attorney plays that role without your wanting him to or knowing that it's happening. But what I mean by good guy and bad guy is, in a sense, a technique, but it does work, where you go into a negotiation, and let us say two people are going in to negotiate. and let us say that you are the staff man of the team, and the other person is literally the owner of the business. Well, the owner of the business, it seems to me, unless this happens to be his personality, shouldn't be the bad guy. If either be the buyer or the seller. He should let his staff person be the bad guy. Be the guy who's very stiff on price and very stiff on terms and making statements which he can, if he chooses to, disavow. I think you can drive your points home. If you find that the statement made antagonizes the other side a great deal, you can disavow it and lose very little. In fact, you can gain something from that. You can gain the image and impression of being a moderating effect, a sort of a statesman-like effect, and that can be very effective in certain situations.
Can you give us an example of a negotiation in which that strategy has been used?
Well, I just really finished one within the past month where myself, the chief executive officer, and his attorney visited with a company much, much larger than ourselves. I'm acting essentially as an advisor to this organization. And we spent the evening and the morning setting up our strategy. And one of the points of strategy was where I was the bad guy. I was the one with the black hat. I was the one that was going to take a vocal position on our asking price. I was going to take a rather vocal position on contradicting the opposition, if you will, with regards to their arguments where they attempted to lower the price. And a number of times during 3 days, the CEO contradicted me or all but told me to shut up. All of this being planned in advance. I don't mean each individual statement. The framework was known to both of us in advance, and therefore if he told me to shut up, I wasn't embarrassed, hurt, or anything else. It was all part of what we agreed we would do. It allowed him to, again, be statesman. It allowed him to ultimately reach a price which I believe was substantially higher than we would have gotten without that tactic. This can be used whether you're a buyer or a seller. In this case, we were a seller. In the case of a buyer, the buyer could have someone over on the side who was his controller or whatever, and he could be the one making statements that could get the selling side annoyed.
What impact did this strategy have on the opposite side of the bargaining table?
At one point, they attempted to take the CEO off by himself into a room and negotiate with him without myself or the attorney present. And that meeting lasted about 15 minutes, and he came out, and I asked him what had gone on, and he said, well, they started discussing price, and I discontinued the conversation.
In that example, the president was seen by the people on the other side of the bargaining table as a way of gaining leverage, given this bad guy, good guy.
They saw him as the reasonable character, the person who could be reasoned with, and they saw me as someone from their perspective as unreasonable. So they attempted to get leverage by dividing and conquering. We maintained our leverage by refusing to be divided and therefore presumably conquered. We had a specific game plan when we went in there, and we stuck to that, essentially stuck to it, as I'm sure they did when they went in. Now, I must say, in all seriousness, I look back on that discussion and I can think of things that we could have done in the area of preparation. We could have gone through, with more time, a list of questions that we were most likely to be presented with. Let me put it another way, a list of weaknesses, perceived weaknesses in our company, be it management, technology, marketplace, domination by a few customers, what have you. And you go through a checklist like that and you begin to carefully plan and lay out answers. I saw in the middle of these negotiations an area where we had failed to do enough homework concerning one of our major customers and their financial strength, It's a customer that had been in a weaker financial condition and was now coming out of it very strongly. And we, I think, lost leverage by not being literally in a position to perhaps put up some financial charts showing the turnaround and the improvement in this customer, focusing on cash flow and balance sheet improvements.
Neil, what are some of the other types of game plans that are used in negotiations involving the acquisition and merger of companies?
You know, ultimately, the whole acquisition and merger business comes down to personalities. The chemistry between the principals involved is so critical, and time has to be allowed for that chemistry to either blend and be a catalyst, or for the chemistry to find itself essentially contradictory in nature. It also has the useful aspect of really determining whether the seller wants to sell. There are a number of sellers who are entranced with the idea of selling, not with the actuality of it. And they really don't want to sell, and it's very difficult for them to reach the point of selling. And I suspect a number of acquisitions have been aborted for reasons which have nothing to do with those that are stated, but more to do with the fact that the seller ultimately either took a disliking to his potential new boss, or finally recognized, or knew all along, he really didn't want to sell. So in a sense, an implicit point of leverage goes back to an earlier comment, learning as early as possible whether you really have a potential deal. Being sure that you're not only close enough on price, but chemistry. And there it becomes more important for the principals to become involved. Alone. They shouldn't have staff people around them. They should have an opportunity for a private dinner and a philosophical exchange and what are your expectations. And the buyer can gain an awful lot of leverage at that point by listening carefully to what the seller is saying, if that seller is going to be working for him, and attempting to sell himself as a person, not the XYZ Corporation or the ABC or whatever, but selling himself as an individual with whom the seller would like to work. Conversely, the seller has his maximum leverage in obtaining perks, if you will, for himself, or things that may not really appear in the price, but are aspects of doing business that he wants to keep on to. It might be, I want to keep my chauffeur-driven car, or I want to keep this, or I want to keep that. You find many more perks, I think, in smaller companies that are family-owned than you do in large, say, listed corporations. So you encounter a situation where the listed corporation tends to be somewhat methodical about the way it goes about it, and they say, well, we can't do this and we can't do that. We have personnel policies and we have these kinds of policies. And if you don't bring these subjects up at the beginning, and it might be literally as small as wanting to have your own chauffeur-driven car or your own division airplane. You want to get those issues on the table and you want to present them that they're important to me and I want to keep them, if they are in fact important. That's another sort of step in gaining and keeping the leverage.